First of all, I have to say I'm delighted to be back on the campus. The last time I was here supporting the occupation. So it's nice to be back on such a politically active kind of space. That always feels nice. I probably should also mention one of my other affiliations, which is that I'm one of the trustees of the Forces Society. And if you're interested in looking at this sort of work being done within Britain, the Forces Society is a very rare women's feminist institution that's been going since, I should know this date precisely, but something like 1862. A continuous tradition of working for women's rights. And it's really interesting to see many of the challenges you're talking about there. The Forces Society has definitely faced over the years. One of the things that I notice that often happens to me as an individual in my role as Green Party leader is I get an invite 2 days before an event. Please, desperately, can you come and speak? And that's partly a result of the fact that we're the Green Party and people think of us as an afterthought. They think of the big three, and then somewhere down the line someone says, oh, shouldn't we invite the Greens? But actually, more often when I go along to that panel, what I find is I'm in my inevitable spot, the token woman spot. 3 days before the event, and what I'm thinking of here are the kind of, the NGOs, the people's assemblies, those kind of, movement kind of events that I speak at very often. 3 days before the event, someone's gone, oh, look at the gender composition of the panel, we're going to get into trouble. And they scramble around and shove a woman on the panel. Or the even more classic example is you have a woman chair. No women speakers, but a woman chair, so hey, we've ticked that box. And it's something that I really notice, and I have to confess that it's not, this isn't only an external thing. The Green Party, you might think when you look at us and you look at the number of women who are in prominent positions in the Green Party, and I am very proud of the fact that I'm the first woman in British political history to have taken over as the leader of a political party from another woman. That has never happened before, which you think we had to get to 2012 to get to that point. It's pretty amazing and pretty telling. But, things aren't perfect by any means in the Green Party. When I first got involved, and long story, but the short version, after I'd been a member for about 9 months, I ended up on the National Executive, which was partly because they were desperate, because there was only one other woman out of about 12 on the National Executive. So I got dragged in for gender balance again. And in fact, because, we were doing interview panels for staff, and, we didn't want all male interview panels for staff, I was on, in my early years, involvement at practically every interview panel that the Green Party had, which is how I came to be interviewing for an accountant. I know absolutely nothing about accountancy, but that's the way it goes. So, these struggles are ongoing and continuous, even in places that can look quite good from the outside. And I go back to this, and I think, when I was looking at Jessica's stuff, the last time I was very much involved in sort of women and development issues was I was in the Thailand working for the National Commission on Women's Affairs as a volunteer. So I basically wrote their report, second and third report for CEDAW, for example. And so I was in Thailand in sort of mid-90s. And I think things have come a long way. For those who feel like sometimes this is an endless struggle and you're making no progress, when I was there in the mid-1990s, what you had was the World Bank had just discovered gender. And you'd go to these UN seminars and someone from the World Bank would go, do you know if you support the women, the communities do much better, in tones of total astonishment. And, maybe we should get a woman or two on the committee that's involved in this local development project. So things have come some distance, although not always as far as we'd like them to. And I think one of the things that's really struck me listening to this, that's really important about this report, is so often women's history gets lost. And we don't see the struggles that have gone before. I was reflecting on what you were saying about the Arab Spring and looking back to the Iranian Revolution. And unless you've read about it, you might not know that feminist movements, progressive movements, were in a huge part, a very important force in overturning the Shah and in ending up with the regime we have in Iran now. And knowing that happened, studying what happened there, and trying to avoid the same mistakes, I think very often because we really struggle to maintain continuity of women's history, continuity of women's traditions, we don't necessarily know those things. And this is actually one of my personal passions, because before the Green Party overtook my life, I had actually started on what turned into a 4-volume history of the women of London. I'm about third way through the first volume. But I'll just mention a name from that. It's a woman called Bathsheba Macon, who was in the 17th century, was an absolute, I was going to say pioneer of women education, but actually that's not true. Because what happened was in Tudor times in Britain, there was a very strong tradition of women's education. And it was actually being destroyed, and she was trying to defend it and fight against it and keep it going. And yet that's a name that's basically only been recovered by feminist scholars in the past 20 years. It was forgotten in all the intervening decades. So I think projects like this are really important. And, the web, it's one of the things that really struck me as compared to when I was last involved with development studies. The web gives you so many more possibilities these days. Because you don't need, much money. You don't need to fly a whole lot of people into the same place to set up a dialogue. You don't need, you can keep a record of things and they'll pretty well sit there as a record without, again, very much input of resources. So we've got huge possibilities that really haven't existed before in history in terms of how you can really go forward with these things. One of the other things that really struck me about your comments was the feminism is not our culture comments. And I thought how difficult that makes of how much we, as in we, the West, we, our military incursions into places like Afghanistan and Iraq, have actually made life so much more difficult for women activists there. Because, they're in a huge bind of speaking up for things that, I think are undeniably non-culture specific human rights. But the struggle is to not ally yourself with the conqueror, not ally yourself with your invader. And, that's an enormously difficult position to be in. And I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's at least, perhaps what we can do is at least identify the problem and see how we can help them. And, that might often mean really, really no strings attached, long distance kind of support and aid, and not getting too close, because you might do more damage by getting close than you do by providing that distance, so their helpfulness. One of the other things that really struck me is the comment about after the revolution. We get this as Green Party women quite often. We're trying to save the planet. Why are you talking about women's rights? We'll do that, sort all that out later. And I think, the whole idea of this has to be built in as central as core, and it's not an either or. And, we get this too. And I think it's a problem. It doesn't just apply to women's rights. It applies to anything that's not the main principal cause. So, I get into trouble with doing things about badgers, because that's not the really important stuff, which is saving the planet and climate change and all of that. And you really have to assert, I think, the right to work on a whole range of things and say all of these things are important and all of these things are worth doing. And if at a particular moment in time I can see something useful to do by acting on that, I'm going to act on that, because I can see a moment where I can make a difference. And I think in terms of that making a difference, the insisting on the difficult stuff being included, because one of the things I think that perhaps Jessica, that struck me also as the next step on, is sometimes you can include the easy stuff. And I was thinking about women's rights issues and environmental issues, and lots of people will tie population into this, although I wouldn't necessarily. And talking about contraceptive rights and access to contraception, that's actually, in some quarters it's difficult, but across lots of quarters that's a pretty mainstream, easy thing to say. What I make sure I always say is contraception and abortion. And contraception is mainstream, abortion is really getting a bit edgy out there. But actually, women don't have control over their own bodies unless they have access to abortion. Contraception doesn't always work. And you actually have to say that and be prepared to get in there and say the difficult stuff, I think. But, be prepared to take the backlash. And I thought the comments about backlash was particularly interesting, because it reminded me, I used to, many years ago, host something called the Feminist Blog Carnival, where I organised it. And this, for those of you who are young enough to be Twitter generation, blog carnivals existed before Twitter, and it was how you found out about new blogs on the subject you were interested in. They've kind of died now. But one of the things I really noticed was that the bloggers who came and went fastest, and some of them were absolutely brilliant bloggers, were ethnic minority feminist women. They, and the ones who would, occasionally would send you sort of plaintive emails saying, how do I deal with the trolls? the trolls are just driving me bonkers. That, it's that intersectionality, that combination of disadvantage, and just acknowledging that and providing as much support as you possibly can. In the feminist blogging community, we did a bit. I think perhaps we didn't do enough, but we tried to provide that kind of support, that kind of forward-looking. The normative values and the gendered power. I was reminded of this. The first Green Party conference I ever went to, we had a meeting of Green Party women, or Women by Name as it was then, an organisation that had never really worked out whether it was women only or not. And so the first half of our 1-hour meeting consisted of a debate whether the one man who was in the room should be in the room or not. and I'd actually, one of the questions I'd like to leave you with is I think actually creating in some way some women-only spaces is absolutely essential, I think, if some really safe spaces. But what was truly amazing and wonderfully illustrative was after we spent the first half of the hour debating whether he should be there, he spent most of the second half hour talking. And, I think this ties into two of the questions that I'm going to leave you with. One is about women-only spaces, and the other is that I do believe, I've come to the view, and I think the Green Party's come to the view and the Fawcett Society's come to the view, that actually quotas are the only answer. And that in case would be quoted spaces. Well, if you're 1/20th of this room, you get 1/20th of the space and talking time. But it's interesting because I think lots of us in the feminist movement generally, and I would include myself in this, a few years ago I would have said, well, women get ahead on their own, don't want quotas, all of that sort of thing. But I was really struck by a comment from a young woman, only 2021, at a Green Party meeting and conference, who said, I want quotas because I'm just so tired of fighting every year to get the women in there. And that's what happens, is you actually, you push women's issues, you push women to the fore, you get the women in there. And unless you have the quota, 2 years later, when you've been thinking about something else and really focusing on something else, you turn around and discover that there's only 2 women on the executive again. And I think, to actually build women into social movements, into political movements, I think we actually have to have quotas. And I know that's likely to be controversial, but what we've got in the European Green Party, and this is where I get even more controversial and slightly more radical, is we don't have gender parity. In the European Green Party, we have a 50% plus rule. So any delegation that a national group sends to the European Green Party, any committee of the European Green Party, has to be at least 50% women. So you can send 2 women and 2 men to a meeting, but you can't send 3 men and 2 women. So you can send 3 women and 2 men. It has to be a minimum of 50% women. And that means any meeting will be at least 50% women of the group. And it's a really interesting example of how that works out, because actually I got approached at the last council meeting I was at because there was a problem, because it was the finance committee, and it only had 3 members, and only 1 woman had stood. And what should they do? Because they couldn't get the quota, and so that would either mean the committee had to be 2 people, or they'd have to break the rule. And I said, well, you're going to have a 2-person committee, because you didn't make sure there were enough women standing. And we actually have to create the structures that say there have to be women in there. There have to be women's issues in there. And I think this report is really valuable in terms of providing, an outline, a brief, a starting point. There's lots more to be done about how we, try and transform all of the organisations we're involved in, because, we've been talking a lot about, the rest of the world, but it's also still very much here in Britain, a huge and continuing issue. So the challenge is all before us. I look forward to it. Thank you.